I'm Ann Artis. I'm Deputy Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences and Director of the college's Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center. And I want to welcome you to the penultimate event in this year's Public Humanities in a Digital World lecture and workshop series. This series is hosted by the Research Center's Digital Humanities Working Group in partnership with the University of Delaware Library, IT Academic Technology Services, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the English Department. Our external partners this year include Hagley Museum and Library and the Library Company of Philadelphia's Program in African American History. Our other on-campus partners for today's event in particular include the Department of Black American Studies and the McNair Scholars Program. So I take this moment to thank all of our co-sponsors for their very generous support of this series, which has created, I think, a really important set of teachable moments on this campus about the digital humanities. Before introducing today's speaker, Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who is, I think it's fair to say he's a rock star at the intersection of the world of research libraries and African American studies, and more on him in a minute. But let me say a bit about this series to give you some context. The Humanities Research Center's Digital Humanities Working Group began meeting in spring 2012 to talk about the transformations in scholarly communication practices that are underway in both research and teaching environments. Last year's Perspectives on Digital Humanities lecture and workshop series provided hands-on training opportunities in things like TEI, GIS, and other DH technology tools, and it served as a showcase for current UD digital humanities projects. It also brought major figures to campus in the field to give public talks on topics ranging from issues of copyright and open access to metadata design, not something that people in the humanities tend to train their students to think about or talk about, the unique challenges of publicly facing humanities research, and the emergence of alternative academic careers. All of these talks are archived in UD Capture and are easily accessible from the IHRC's website in case you're interested in catching yourself up on some of those conversations. This year's series sustains last year's effort to enliven the campus community's conversations about key issues in the field through engagement with nationally and internationally recognized experts. But it also, and very deliberately, is more focused on infrastructure issues. The how-tos of not only developing but also sustaining digital humanities research and teaching projects, faculty projects, student projects, projects involving faculty and students, not all of whom stay forever at an institution. Issues related to authorship, intellectual property, and copyright in collaboratively authored digital research collections. Project management issues, especially for projects involving teams of faculty, undergraduates, graduate students collaborating interinstitutionally, but in humanities disciplines whose research conventions and teaching practices actually are still designed to recognize and reward the efforts of researchers and teachers working on their own, in their own classrooms. And also the challenges and opportunities of publicly facing research, crowdsourcing, partnering with non-academic experts. Given the focus of this year's series, it's my special pleasure to welcome this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, the director of the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Dr. Muhammad received his PhD in American History from Rutgers University in 2004. As an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow, he was affiliated with the Vera Institute of Justice, a nonprofit criminal justice reform agency in New York City, for 2 years. He did this before joining the faculty of the History Department at Indiana University. He's the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2010, and which won the American Studies Association's highly coveted John Hope Franklin Publication Prize. He has served as an associate editor of the Journal of American History and as a member of the editorial board of Transition magazine, which is published by the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. Dr. Mohammed began his appointment as director of the Schomburg in July 2011. Is that right? Do I have that? Yeah. A research unit of the New York Public Library System, the Schomburg is recognized globally as well as nationally as one of the leading institutions focusing exclusively on African American, African diaspora, and African experiences. Begun with the collections of Arturo Alfonso Schomberg more than 85 years ago, the Schomburg has collected, preserved, and provided access to materials documenting Black life in America and worldwide. It has also promoted the study and interpretation of the history and culture of peoples of African descent through its community outreach programming, as well as its fellowships for both senior scholars and very young apprentice scholars. Today, the Schomburg continues to serve the community not just as a research center and a library, but also as a space that encourages lifelong education and exploration. And in his meeting with students this afternoon, the phrasing he used, which really stuck with me, the Schomburg is a place of community and congregation. It's a research library, but it's a community space at the very same time. The Schomburg has embraced the digital humanities, understanding it as a way to provide access to trusted information, interpretation, and scholarship on the global Black experience to audiences and researchers who might actually never be able to work on site with its extraordinary resources. At the very same time, it somehow, amazingly, manages to be this place of community and congregation for a tri-state audience in the New York area through its exhibitions and its programmings. So please join me in giving a very warm University of Delaware welcome to Dr. Mohammed.
I guess it's evening. I don't know. It says 5 o'clock. With this extended winter we're having, if this were spring, I think we'd all feel like this was a late afternoon, but the weather, the cold, I'm sick of it. It's a little tight up here, so give me a minute. I want to thank some wonderful people who are responsible for me being here, and let me begin by thanking my dear friend and former undergraduate fellow traveler, Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. So she and I have known each other for a long time, and this is an opportunity for us to work together as colleagues. She joins me now in the Special Collections community as the Program Director of African American History at the Library Company of Philadelphia. So thank you for playing a major part in me being here. I want to thank Ann Artis, of course, for the wonderful work that she's doing here to convene these conversations around the digital humanities, for being a host today. I want to thank Carol Rudisell, who is an old family friend. She is a friend of my, best friend of my stepmother's. I've known her now for more than half my life, and she's a librarian here, for those who don't know, at UD. Also want to thank Susan Bryanston, how do you say Susan's last name? Brentinson, who spent some time with our group this afternoon, and for her leadership here at the University of Delaware Library, to Carol Henderson, the chair of Black Studies, to the wonderful students who I spent time with, from undergraduates to graduate students in history and English and political science, and some terrific archivists, to Tim Murray, to Rebecca Melvin Johnson, and Curtis Small. Thank you for putting together a wonderful presentation of the special collections here at the University of Delaware. So I feel good about that, yeah. And I have a really good friend here from graduate school, Tiffany Gill, who's a new faculty member here in the history department. So she is a rock star as well, so look out. I just said to Anne that, she said, Erica, you went to undergrad with, Tiffany, you went to graduate school with. I said, listen, you don't get anywhere without having terrific friends. So I certainly feel blessed to have had a community to support me in what I do, and I support them as well. Today's lecture is entitled, Can Digital Humanities Save Us? Research Libraries, Historical Illiteracy, and the Future of Brown America. So first, let me warn you by saying that it's a long lecture, so stay awake. Secondly, I want to say that there's a lot here, because the exciting thing about doing what I do and representing this amazing institution, but also being in conversation with my peers, both in the library space as well as in the broader humanities, and particularly those who do history research, means that there's a lot of complexity and a lot to talk about. And so I don't miss an opportunity to leave you with as much as possible to talk and think about. And if you don't like something I said, then let me know and we'll revise for the next time. So this talk is broken up into 3 parts. The first part is what is the Schomburg, which you've heard a little bit about, so I won't spend as much time on that in the beginning. The second is Digital Schomburg, which is our platform for engaging people the world over in our digital space. And then why does any of this matter? So let me begin. The Schomburg Center is nationally and internationally known as the leading archive of the African American and global Black experience. For its uniqueness, it is the nation's equivalent, booster alert, of the Library of Congress and National Archives. With its 10 million items, it supports researchers, writers, creative artists of all kinds and from every background. It is not only a repository dedicated to the collection, preservation, and interpretation of life, history, and culture, it is also an international research institute, a cultural center, a museum, and a performing arts center. No other institution in New York City, or indeed the nation, offers as broad or diverse a range of cultural and educational resources. And it is worth emphasizing that we are free and open to the public. We serve everyone. We offer exhibitions featuring the works of people as varied as Romare Bearden to Gordon Parks, as well as documenting the 14th century presence of East Africans in India. These exhibitions recently have seen record attendance. We have dynamic programming featuring leading scholars and Pulitzer Prize winning writers from David Remnick to Isabel Wilkerson. The Schomburg Center indeed is fast becoming one of New York's leading venues for the literary arts. And I'm proud to say that at 6:30 when I'm wrapping up, Chimamanda Adichie, award-winning author, and most recently of Americana, along with award-winning author Zadie Smith, will be on stage at the Schomburg at 6:30. So look for the live stream link when you leave here if you want to be a part of that experience. Our collections indeed represent people from all over the world. And here you see the actual physical brick and mortar place. It is representing a 75,000 square foot institution combining 3 separate buildings, one including the landmark building, which opened in 1904, serving a largely German immigrant community in Upper Manhattan that over time transformed into a largely Southern and Caribbean immigrant community. And that was the impetus originally for searching, as good librarians are supposed to do, for new material for its new neighbors. You can't really see that part of the building, but it's to the far left. You can see the upper windows of it. This main building was built in 1980 and has been expanded upon over more recent years. But I also wanted you to see that this is at the cross sections of an incredibly rich and vibrant community. And so this notion of where it sits, both within an incredibly significant academic space, is also an everyday intersection. Harlem Hospital is literally on this side of the street, the same hospital that gave birth to County Cullen and James Baldwin, means that this is a place that is part of the historic roots of this community. 135th Street used to be the actual corridor of Black life before it moved 10 blocks to the south at 125th Street. And of course, we are easy to get to, so I encourage all of you, Amtrak to Penn Station, SEPTA to New Jersey Transit, to Penn Station. The 2 of the 3 drops you right. You don't even need a coat. So our collections represent people at these intersections from all over the world. South Asian communities are in our collections, not because they are African Americans, but because their experiences were in proximity to African Americans. Bengali Harlem is a work recently published celebrating that history of South Asians in Harlem. It's also important to note that people who come from countries with significant African descendant populations who they themselves may not identify within the Black American tradition, countries from, of course, the Caribbean, from Latin America to West and South Africa, are captured in many ways within the collections and continue to attract heads of state and cultural ambassadors from as far away as India, from Antigua and Barbuda, from the Dominican Republic, from Brazil, so on and so forth. And in some ways, one of the big arguments that I'm making here about the role of research libraries, repositories, and cultural institutions in general is that you can't really appreciate particularly America today and the gains that have been made without recognizing the important contributions that people in this country made to representing traditions and ethnicities from all over the globe. That is, even immigration reform since 1965 owes a debt to the civil rights struggles and the anti-racist social movements that preceded this moment. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we move into part 2, Digital Schomburg. Digital Schomburg started in the 1990s with exhibitions on the African diaspora in the Americas, in Harlem, 19th century photographs. More sophisticated exhibitions were organized in the early 2000s, such as Lest We Forget or the African Burial Ground. But the first major project was In Motion, the African American migration experience, for which the center received a $2.4 million grant from the IMLS, courtesy of advocacy on the part of the Congressional Black Caucus. And what I've done here in a quasi-low-tech way is to screenshot the image of the website. I didn't want to take a risk that we'd have Wi-Fi challenges in this space, and so you, of course, are invited to visit these web pages. But this is a laundry list of the digital online exhibitions called Digital Schomburg that have been expanded since the 1990s. This IMLS grant was a 3-year project that went live in 2005. The exhibition traces 13 migrations in 16,500 pages of essays, illustrations, maps, lesson plans, books, book chapters, and articles. On the first day, no surprise, the site crashed due to the overwhelming demand, and since then it has been, and we are extremely proud to say this, in a large bureaucratic system known as the New York Public Library with 2,000 employees, 18 million visitors, and 90 branches, that our exhibition In Motion has been the most visited online exhibition in NYPL's history. Just again for illustrative purposes, so that we weren't tied necessarily to the internet, this is what the interface looks like. This is the home screen. And what I think is really crucial, you've heard a little bit of the scale of In Motion and what it attempted to do, is that it really reimagines migration, not just through the African American lens, not just through a more contemporary lens, but really through the prism of the transatlantic slave trade. And so in a moment where conversations about the Black Atlantic over the last nearly 20 years now, well, I guess we just celebrated the 20th year anniversary of Gilroy's work, this was a project that tried to take those scholarly insights, not only translate them into a digital humanities space, but to do it in a way that would meet the demands of a scholarly audience at the same time to open up to a K-12 audience. To really be as much of an invitation for seeing what kinds of primary archival material in this digital form would invite further research, at the same time that teachers and students could learn something in an interactive way. And we are extremely proud that it continues to be, as I've already said, one of the most visited exhibition. So this is what it looks like when you visit. You can see to the left, those are the organizing, essentially the table of contents organized thematically across time and space. Moving more directly, here we look at one particular subheading. So this is Caribbean migration. And I chose this one because the subtitle of today's talk is The Future of Brown America. And one of the things that I'm interested in is in what ways does a repository like the Schomburg have to reimagine its audiences in light of larger shifts in this country. And to the extent that the digital humanities become a platform for introducing us to audiences who've not yet literally left the homeland from wherever people are traveling, is an interesting way to think about that relationship between this access abroad and how that becomes an invitation to the physical experience. Because I think one of the tensions around digital humanities, and it's certainly something I'm sure you've explored here, but something that our archivists have communicated a lot of anxiety about over the years and only recently have let go of, is this idea that what we put online disincentivizes people from actually walking through our doors. And so I think all of us in this collective space are trying to think creatively about what is the relationship between this access and the ways in which it's used in a digital space and the need for community and congregation within those boundaries. And so I wanted to, again, just to highlight for visual purposes, this is what In Motion looks like. This is the story of Caribbean immigration. And we brought together graphically, in a very useful way, the ongoing experience of people more recently. So this is a way to speak to these audiences from the gate, because for many people, this is the story that's not captured in the usual trajectory of Black history. And I don't know how often you hear in the public history conversation that, well, African American story dominates the story. What about people who are from the Caribbean? What about those of us who are second generation, whose parents came here in an earlier time period? So again, this is a way to invite them into the conversation, but again, imagined in a much larger conversation about these migrations. And again, I can't take any of the credit for this. This was a project that began almost 10 years ago. So this is what the map looks like within this context. This is, if you click on the images, you'll see, and some of this is old school by today's digital technology standards. In other words, even NYPL is moving into a far more sophisticated space in terms of how it visually presents photographic images, even books. You know, we've got page turning books and these sorts of things. But this was for Schomburg and ultimately for NYPL cutting edge. And we did it actually in a kind of guerrilla fashion, not only securing an IMLS grant, sort of not necessarily without the imprimatur of the mothership, but also in the end, the infrastructure of NYPL back in 2005 was not entirely prepared to handle an exhibition of this nature. And so even to this day, it lives outside of the actual infrastructure of the New York Public Library's digital catalog and websites. As you've seen, we've gone on to produce many more digital exhibitions, and right now we're expecting to launch the latest in 2014, which will be called Black New Yorkers, which is another variation of a similar theme, which is to capture the tremendous diversity of African Americans from the colonial period of settlement to contemporary realities, also simultaneously telling that story. Taking a closer peek at some of these images, again, the first migration of sugar-producing plantations in the Caribbean, here from Jamaica. This is a lithograph from a book published, Henry T. DeLuca, Notes on the Present Condition of Negroes in Jamaica. Another image, moving more recently, between 1930 and 1965, third wave West Indians migrating to the United States, often part of the middle class, well educated. This collection comes from our Austin Hansen collection. So again, just illustrative purposes, but showing that congregation matter. So right now we have an Antigua Barbuda exhibition called Lighthouse in New York, which is based on a collection of a mutual aid society that begins in New York City as a way station and a place for receiving those new immigrants. I had the pleasure of hosting and greeting the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Spencer Baldwin of Antigua and Barbuda at the Schomburg Center. And this, again, is a way, so when you think about digital humanities, what does it mean to have some representation of this community while still having a physical manuscript collection, and at the same time inviting a former prime minister to be part of a conversation about that. And I think those are the things that we have to do when we talk about being outwardly facing public humanities people in addition to our digital humanities work. Looking at the essays, so we talked about part of this project included inviting scholars to contribute to the project itself. And so Winston James, a Caribbean scholar formerly at Columbia University, wrote a lead essay, The History of Afro-Caribbean Migration to the United States. It was scholarly, it was intended to be so, but again, it anchors the resources that run the gamut of a number of primary resources, and then where we could get fair use rights or the right to republish other kinds of instructional material, we included it there. So you see reprints or republications of Du Bois's work from an autobiography and several other instances, primary government information as well. And then finally, there's an inclusion of educational materials. And so we developed a curriculum here that identifies national curricular standards, focuses on which age cohort the material is appropriate to instruct, laying out what is needed for the instruction material. There is more to this. I didn't clip the rest, but lays out the actual exercise, what the students need, questions, assessments, so on and so forth. I think it's important because there's many kinds of digital humanities, right? So those digital humanities that are focused on K through 12, and we see a big space expanding around Common Core, which is itself controversial, and its future is uncertain, perhaps for good reason. But third-party vendors in the private space are building capacity to do that kind of work, and so we're seeing increasing online space where even New York Public Library is being courted by a number of vendors because guess what? Educational vendors in the private market, they don't have archives. So they need archival institutions to participate in that. So because I happen to be a little bit ambivalent about Common Core, it's not that we aren't participating, but we're going to continue to claim the space for ourselves. And we're going to continue to develop content in this space where we're not dependent on Common Core standards that are vulnerable to the political winds of what kinds of history are worth teaching. And that's the third part of the conversation, or at least the lecture today. Yes. So these projects have been an essential part of the Schomburg's commitment and focus on its outward-facing mission in terms of digital humanities. So occupying everything, as Southerners are wont to say, from the rooter to the tutor, but in this case, from the kindergarten space all the way through the postdoctoral scholarly field. As much as we try and attempt to meet those needs within our physical space, we want to be represented in that space in the digital humanities. Just a few more words about what we've achieved in terms of our digital Schomburg overall. Here has been an in-depth look at In Motion. In Africa and the African diaspora, you can browse more than 11,000 items ranging from prints and photographs to historical documents. Cultures representing the 17th to the 20th centuries. And here I want to talk a little bit about In Motion in the beginning. So there was, as I've already said, some reluctance on the part of many of the curators to have items digitized on such a massive scale. Their fear, patrons were not going to come to the center, making the divisions of the center irrelevant. As you well know, we are now competing for, we don't do circs. So in library language, number of books going out the door. We do internal circs, which is slightly different in the research community, unlike a university system where books do leave the building. So there's a little bit of tension for the Schomburg where we are, think of us, even though we have a general reference division, everything is a special collection by our standards. And even that's changing because of the pressure to show the usefulness of our collections. So whereas circs was and remains the gold standard, say for example in a circulating collection of a research library, page views will increasingly become the representation in digital humanities space. Rights management, however, has always been a challenge, mostly concerning the costs, as some institutions charge exorbitant fees or are unwilling to have an item displayed online for more than 2 years. Working with web designers, for example, for us, which was an outsourced project as opposed to done in-house, was incredibly frustrating as they tried to impose their views, basing it on fallacious technical grounds. You have to be very clear from the beginning of what you expect when working with these third-party vendors, what you want your site to look like, and to firmly defend it. Because if, as you well know, the design of it is not compatible with the way in which you want the pedagogical voice to be heard, then you're working at cross purposes. One of the positive aspects of working on these has been truly the contributions of the scholarly community. And giving them, clear guidelines as to how to write for a general public audience, even with scholarly heft, has been both the challenge and the joy of seeing the final product. These scholars often are incredibly eager to share their research outside of academia. More to come on that. Between 2005 and 2014, more recently between In Motion, where we began, and our latest installment, Black New Yorkers, which should be up sometime in this calendar year, the advance in technology has enabled us to do much more while spending less time and money. We can get digital files directly from institutions rather than prints that must then be scanned. We can create videos and interactive maps. Google Maps, of course, has been incredibly helpful and efficient in being able to do things that once required outsourcing to digital map makers. And finally here, to put this in metrics context, between 2009 and 2014, In Motion has had 4 million page views and over 803,000 visitors from 219 countries and territories, including, most recently, South Sudan. So in thinking about how do people find what you have is another challenge, because I'm sure some of you have already participated in grant projects where you've created new digital portals, and it's there, and it's amazing, and no one can find it. Or it doesn't have the visibility that it merits the content that is actually there. And so accelerators, aggregators are, of course, a critical part, and Google has played a part for us. But frankly, we were in some ways first to the game on this scale. And so as a result of that, we get the most hits because we're visible in the Google algorithm for our digital exhibitions. I am not the technical expert to be able to address that for newcomers to the field, but it is something to think about. Just as another example, Africana Age, which was launched in March of 2011, has also had nearly 1 million page views. It alone represents 18% of the total traffic to NYPL's exhibitions, which is, again, for us, truly remarkable. By comparison, NYPL launched a very popular, and by that I mean our colleagues at 42nd Street launched a very popular online exhibition accompanying a physical show called Lunch Hour, which invited people to crowdsource a really quirky and eccentric collection of menus across New York City, a way of telling New York City's history through the prism of food. But if you can imagine what was on those menus, both in terms of price and in terms of actual menu items, was unknown to most people. So they digitized everything, put it up, and invited people to go in and actually not so much translate, but if you could think of taking a foreign language to English, in this case, just taking a scanned picture and actually inputting in, I guess, what is it, OCR technology? Again, I won't pretend this is not what I do for a living. But by virtue of that, now people can actually tell a history of New York through the prism of food and look at how different kinds of food tastes have changed over the years. It's really fascinating stuff. But that exhibition, Lunch Hour, is the second-ranked NYPL exhibition with a share of 5.3% compared to Africana Age. In Motion has its own rankings because it precedes our ability to compare it, because it was that far ahead of the curve. A last word on Digital Schomberg itself, in terms of the big picture of what it's meant for us as an institution. It functions not only as a source of high-value knowledge and expert-based interpretation, but also as an archive and as a point of entry into larger archives with more accessibility than our special collections. It also provides easier discoverability, which is essential to promoting and maximizing the use of our collections. We see it as the entry point for many people. no matter who you are, the lay person who's been told, there's something for you in terms of Caribbean immigration at Digital Schomburg, which will help prepare you to think about what it means to be in this migration train as you move to the United States. Some of our digital collections or specific items are difficult to find on the NYPL website, either due to imperfect metadata, sheer numbers of items in a collection, or because of users' imprecise keywords. We have not solved all of these problems. In addition, users do not necessarily know that a particular collection is entirely or partially relevant to a topic they are interested in. So again, librarians, archivists, we still matter. Important point to keep in mind. And finally, our curated exhibitions bring forth illustrations and documents that relate to specific issues, but beyond, they enable the user who wants to go further to access the digital collections these items come from, and to become aware of and consult on-site collections that are not digitized. So, for example, to note an image of Caribbean immigrants in 1935 Harlem done by Austin Hanson is, guess what, the tip of the iceberg of the Austin Hanson collection in our photo and prints division, which is overwhelmingly not digital. So this final section, this section about why does any of this matter, to me cuts closer to the bone of a conversation that I think folks in the digital humanities field have to engage in. It is not sufficient to make this a conversation amongst techies and those who are looking to make a name for themselves in a quickly evolving field. All of that is fine, well, and good and critically important. But if it isn't done in concert with a larger, as I think it is now clearer for many to see, a crisis in the humanities, then digital humanities could, in fact, rather than being an opportunity for saving what we do, could be the nail in the coffin for eliminating who we are as archivists and librarians. And I want to suggest then that the challenges that face the digital humanities are part and parcel of a larger challenge that faces the humanities. There's something sexy and forward-thinking and innovative and STEM-related in the work that we do, and certainly the ways in which technology allow librarians to do things faster and with greater efficiency than ever before could, in an unintended way, just like the cotton gin was a wonderful advance in machine technology, certainly advanced slavery in ways that were, well, certainly intended, but unintended in the purest sense of the word. I just use that technology example because technology does not exist in a vacuum. And in a context where technology becomes the governing, organizing principle of what is important in society, it continues to pose an existential crisis to the kinds of questions that humanists are fundamentally interested in, including the history of science and technology. So I want to cite here the American Academy of Arts and Sciences recently published report, The Heart of the Matter. I want to invite all of you to take a look at it if you have not done so. The New York Public Library was a site of convening. I participated in it along with David Blight, a scholar of slavery at Yale University, including representatives from both NYPL special divisions and Mellon Foundation. But this series of convenings took place all across the country, focusing on the role of various humanities-based organizations, from those in the educational space to those in higher ed to those in the cultural institutions and libraries. This report was a call to action for the nation to address a general decline in humanities research, teaching, and learning. It found that too few parents are reading to young children, K-12 social studies teachers are poorly trained, and that Americans have become more parochial, less worldly in their education pursuits, in spite of all of the rich stories that we can tell from our own archives. In the drive for technological supremacy in the world, the nation's humanistic enterprises have literally or increasingly been left on the side of the road. and nothing less than our civic culture, our workforce, and as they write, national security are at stake. I'm a little bit weary of the national security language, but I understand why they deploy it. The humanities, they write, remind us where we have been and help us to envision where we are going. As many of you probably read, the New York Times featured a story not too long after the report, noting that faculty members at Stanford University's main undergraduate division, that 45% of faculty members at Stanford are in the humanities, but only 15% of students are majoring, representing a real crisis for Stanford's commitment to those faculty and to those departments. Harvard has experienced a 20% decline in humanities majors over the last decade, a recent report found. And most students who say they intend to major in humanities end up in other fields. And I want us to think about this evidence as we define it, these signposts for what is going on in the humanities as literally a call to action for you. This doesn't just happen out there, unrelated to the work that you do in your various pursuits here at the University of Delaware. The American Academy provided further evidence that between 2005 and 2011, there have been steady declines in federal funding for academic research. Humanities has decreased for NEH funding 50% from a high point of 30% of the overall pie or proportion of funding for humanities down to 20%. In every STEM field, every science, technology, engineering, and math field, funding is over 60%, over 60% of their funding is by the federal government, and all areas have seen increases or have remained the same. So that's where the investment is being made. Again, to think about, if you make the case for the work that you do based only through the lens of technology, you may get money in the short term, only to see the very archive from which those technological advances that you did your humanity. You say, well, you know, it's really expensive to keep papers forever. It's really expensive to conserve the material. But as you know, the pipeline doesn't exist, right, for digitization without the assets of our archives. Only in the medical sciences, they report notes, has the amount decreased roughly 5%. Well over half of all humanities research is funded by academic institutions. And therefore, places like Stanford and Harvard, God help us at the University of Delaware, or at my former alma mater, or where I formerly taught at Indiana University, that the pie will continue to shrink for the scholarly work that we do and our overall commitment to digital humanities. In the end, the main problem in the report, as well as those cited in the article, turn on financial resources and priorities. Translation, money for your English professors and your half-dozen majors. Show me the money. So to make more money for humanities endeavors, indeed, the Academy suggested more scholars take their knowledge off campus, to take their show on the road. And I'm going to read you here a statement. If scholars in the broad humanistic disciplines expect the public to be more financially supportive, and I underscore here, they must make the case for public value of their work much more effectively than they have in recent years. This is not just a matter of sharpened message points to budget appropriators, they note. Everything scholars do to connect with the broader public advances their case for support, and everything they do to neglect it weakens that case. Top scholars should embrace the chance to connect with the larger community and help it feel the interest of their subjects and the power of their analyses. Not every researcher needs to be a, quote, public intellectual. An instant popular appeal must not be the touchstone for scholarly value, but one can maintain scholarly integrity even while engaging a variety of audiences. Renewed funding may arise together with renewed effort to remind Americans of the meaning and value of the humanities and social sciences. It is unlikely to come without it. I want you to think about that, but I also want you to think, therefore, it's not sufficient to spend all of your intellectual capital, all of your passion and your energy creating the website, and then wiping your hands clean, moving on to the next project, because it actually requires the work of sharing what you have done so that you actually have money to do the next project, because it could be your last project if nobody pays any attention to what you've done. There's another challenge here. And this challenge exists not just in the space of proving within our funding communities and within our institutional spaces of why what we do matter and must continue to be invested, but we have a larger crisis of anti-intellectualism in this country. And I'm just going to cite here a different kind of source material, an example, but I think, again, it's just a signpost of the times. Lewis Lapham wrote a couple of years ago in an article called Ignoring the Past in Harper's Weekly, that there is an increasingly illiterate populace to be as poorly informed about American history as they are about the history of ancient Egypt or modern Uzbekistan. He notes in a recent survey that 76% of college graduates are unfamiliar with the Bill of Rights, and I saw a copy of the Bill of Rights today, remarkable. 73% of respondents unable to identify America's antagonists during 4 decades of the Cold War. He notes that this grows out of a context where Americans have an amazing capacity for what he calls grand simplification, where this grand simplification dismisses the actual complexity of history in exchange for simple narrative that don't invite further reflection, don't call upon us to actually debate or reinterpret the case, but to simply consume what the gatekeepers of public discourse actually tell us. He says, for example, why then argue for uses of history other than ones that sponsor the election campaigns, blow the bubbles on Wall Street, underwrite the nation's wars? For him, these uses of history are all around us, but in fact are not an invitation for us for further reflection, are not an occasion for what we do either in the archival space or the digital humanities space to challenge the public discourse, but to actually be passive recipients. This is also the space in which our ability to Google information to satisfy our instant appetite for information versus what Carter G. Woodson called education actually, again, works against the academic enterprise. Indeed, the ease with which certain kinds of information is available gives us a false sense of collective security that we actually know something about a subject. Anybody here who cares deeply about the scholarly project or scholarly enterprise recognizes that the more you study a topic, the more that you study the past or culture or literature, the less you actually know. Lapham's bitter critique of the abysmal state of historical illiteracy wasn't just about what our children aren't reading or learning as articulated in the American Academy Report. No, Lapham suggested something far more troubling and enduring, that politics and ideology are also at play with what, how, and how much we learn about the past. Indeed, one could argue that the very foundation and shape of the humanities and social sciences in the late 19th century U.S. were moved by the spirit of public intellectualism, big ideas by big-time scholars meant to shape knowledge in the world, to advance the American project. This was what gave birth to the progressive era, this notion of knowledge in the service of social transformation. It could be eugenics knowledge in the social of immigration restriction, or it could be knowledge of poverty and industrialization in the service of expanding government intervention to create more opportunity. How ironic it seems then that the very core values that made America, the American university, what they are, have fallen on such hard times. What if the heart of the matter, the report by the American Academy, is not just money and ideology, but also the century-long repudiation of the very core humanistic ideas that changed this country and indeed the world? As a scholar of race relations and as a caretaker of one of the most expansive repositories on the African American and the global Black experience, I can't help but notice the absence of racial knowledge as a factor in the crisis of the humanities today, this future of brown America. Let me tell you a story about the man whose collection is at the heart of the 90-year-old institution I have the privilege of leading. Arturo Schomburg is one of the central figures in the development of historical consciousness among people of African descent. From the Caribbean to Latin America to the United States, no other figure, arguably, was as committed to using history to end colonialism and racism. As a bibliophile and a collector, he was a historian's best friend and an activist's tutor. His legacy shaped modern freedom struggles and the very expansion of democracy in the Americas. And just as a kind of reminder here, as an emphasis of the point, what I am saying here is that what the heart of the matter doesn't acknowledge is that perhaps the humanistic discipline, when it finally appreciated the voices, the counter-narrative of those who stood outside of the protections of democracy in the world, when it finally caught up to a more expansive vision of democracy, a consequence of the work of those early librarians and archivists who fueled the poetry of people like Langston Hughes, who inspired the pen of men like James Baldwin or women like Zora Neale Hurston, who provided the raw material for those who would speak truth to power. Maybe that's when the humanities started to become less important to what this country's about. That's a very different kind of challenge than one that I think we're as prepared to acknowledge, and suggests to me that in a demographic shift in a nation that will be a brown country going forward, that the humanities may indeed end up in the dustbin of history. Because if we aren't training folks to fight for the narratives of the past that actually are something that we ought to be proud of, those of us on certain sides of this historical divide, then it's possible that that brown America will have spokespersons who don't even appreciate the very history that they represent. The analogy I like to use is like, imagine that someone from Mars shows up one day. And you know, historians are not supposed to engage in counterfactuals, but again, we're on shaky ground these days, and so I encourage you, everybody else is using counterfactuals. At least we have informed counterfactuals. Someone shows up from Mars one day, and they look, they're an ambassador, an interplanetary ambassador. They look around and they see brown leadership. You know, let's just say Obama's just the tip of the iceberg. So in various halls of justice and leadership in this nation, there are brown people representing leadership in this country. They go on a tour. They want to look around in the archives of various institutions. They want to go into the leading museums. What might they see? Will they see Black New Yorkers in motion, Africana age? Or will they see a vision of America that remains a vision trapped in the early 19th century, representing a Eurocentric perspective on this country and its founding narratives of what it stood for? Will our actual history evolve beyond our books and our classrooms and our digital humanities projects to actually transform the meta-narratives of what the humanities actually are in this country, which is far less white, far less male than most certainly it used to be. Will those visitors from Mars be confused when they go and look in our museums and see the small galleries around the corner to the right that actually looks like the people who are in charge, rather than this pale race that once inhabited this country? That is what is at stake in this moment, crowded out by concerns about technology, crowded out by just the sheer politics of knowledge, also known as the culture wars and the history wars. I want to spend a few minutes coming back to this problem of race, because I want to remind you that the world that Arturo Schomburg engaged, the world that he met on its terms, was a world deeply committed to white supremacist narratives. And if we in the digital humanities or in the archival space are afraid to own that there is a history that matters to the work that we do, if we don't actually provide a kind of roadmap to the content that we can provide, rather than it's all here, we're here to serve you, make use of it what you want, I think that's exactly the difference between what we've been doing and what the Academy of Sciences is saying we ought to be doing, that we ought to be speaking to. So we have a story to tell in our archive, particularly the Schomberg, where someone like Arturo Schomburg was directly engaged with a writer, an academic like Hubert Hull Bancroft, who had written, for example, "The Negro," and I quote, "is too incompetent and unreliable as a citizen." In the early 20th century, he is an unmitigated nuisance, and judging from the past, he will remain so. However learned he may become, however lofty his ideals, or how high his aspirations, he must wear the badge of ignorance and servitude. He and his children forever. God hath made him so. We do not need the Negro for any purpose, and never shall. What's fascinating about this is not just that he, among many Eurocentric and white supremacist writers of the late 19th and early 20th century, articulated such things, but that Schomburg himself was inspired by encountering such ideologies in his moment, and therefore wrote in response to Bancroft's work, quote, "Where are our Negro historians, our defenders who have let Bancroft commit such a dastardly crime against the Negro race?" There is evidence that similar crimes against, pardon the pun, humanity are being committed at this very moment. In fact, I cannot overstate the significance of what Schomburg had gotten himself into. These were, in this moment of the early 20th century, powerful ideas articulated by the most significant thought leaders and thinkers of the time. These were not schoolyard insults, minor league stuff. This was major league. Schomburg put himself, by taking on Bancroft, squarely in the middle of debates that would shape the course of the post-emancipation history of the Americas. You can't have a post-1965 Immigration Act if the stain and stigma of Afro-descendant people is the badge of inferiority and ignorance, except perhaps to do the unwanted jobs of America. But we know that many of the post-1965 immigrants didn't come by virtue of being, as with European immigrants in the early 20th century, simply laborers. Many of them came precisely because of their better education, of their cultural capital, and their ability to fill professional jobs, like so many wonderfully talented Nigerian students filling the ranks of higher education today. Let's then pause for a minute and take, for example, debates about education. We know today how important education is, of course, to the future of young people. We know that math and science are more important than ever, but we also know that a quality education is often a privilege that leaves many behind, especially those who are considered black in many parts of the world. This is not an accident. Good education, classical training, liberal arts, and high science were reserved for the white elite. From the beginning, the best land, the best schools, the best jobs, and racist ideas justify that inequality. I'm going to share with you an example from my own work written by the leading paleontologist in the nation from Harvard University, who published widely in magazines such as the Atlantic Monthly, still in circulation today, largely liberal, focused on high literature and cultural trends, as well as popular science. Shaler liked to tell a joke, this Harvard paleontologist, that speaks volumes about how education was not meant for African Americans. This is, again, the world that Schomburg took on. He told this joke, he said, you can't get algebra and clean corners into the same nigger. The world needs clean corners. It's not so particular about the algebra. And yet we know right now that we're debating, for example, how much algebra should be taught to young Black and Latino school children. You can read articles in the paper about whether Algebra 2 is for everybody. My point here illustratively is that these conversations about what we learn, about what we teach, are inseparable about who we are talking about in terms about what we are learning and what we are teaching and the appropriate resources to do that kind of work. Let me highlight then a couple of things about the trajectory of this center that Schomburg established, only to put it in direct conversation with the actual landscape of ideology that Schomburg inherited. He himself called for the necessity of this material evidence of African contributions to civilization to be in direct service, to be used to wage a larger battle of ideas about the place of Black people in the United States and in post-emancipation Caribbean communities. As you well know, he was an incredibly committed observer of the state of Cuba's African population and what role the Afro-Cuban population would play in Cuba's independence, and was sorely disappointed when that possibility did not come to fruition. Ultimately, he committed himself within the context of the Schomburg Library, which is established in 1926 at precisely the moment that the Harlem Renaissance is all the rage. Carter G. Woodson has just founded Black History Week, and the entire enterprise of cultural arts and letters, what David Levering Lewis described as civil rights by copyright. Think about that. Civil rights by copyright is actively engaged in the anti-racist struggles of that interwar generation. These scholar activists, these anti-racist writers, these cultural critics of America did not leave it to chance that their work might inspire, might make a difference, might be used by others. They themselves took an active interest in creating those communities of congregation so that that work would happen. Thinking about the importance of history then, thinking about the importance of the humanities in relation to race, politics, ideology, the crisis of humanities, I want to share one of my favorite quotes from Dr. King, because it's one that we often don't think about, and we certainly as humanists don't use to our advantage. Dr. King is known for many things. Of course, his moral critique of American racism, for his radical shift late in his life, something that we generally memorialize and discuss during annual commemorations of his life. But one of the things we don't hear from Dr. King often is that he spoke extensively about the importance of history. He spoke extensively in much of his writing about the relationship of historical literacy, particularly among those whose history had been denied, stolen, elided, erased. He said, for example, in his 1967 publication, Where Do We Go From Here, quote, "The history books, which have almost completely ignored the contribution of the Negro in American history, have only served to intensify the Negro's sense of worthlessness and to augment the anachronistic doctrine of white supremacy. Wasn't this Schomburgian? Wasn't this articulation a debt to the very project that Schomberg had engaged himself nearly 3/4 of a century before, that the history books could carry such weight and importance, that the humanities actually is one of the core battlegrounds for what this country is and, dare I say, should be? The world that Dr. King left behind, therefore, is an instructive world for us to note. By the late 1960s, some of the leading grassroots organizations that turned to history, to historical literacy, as a cornerstone of a new political consciousness and racial consciousness, a kind of identity that would secure a sense of purpose in the world, which is exactly what our museums stand for. It's why we have cultural heritage in the first place. The question is, whose cultural heritage shall we celebrate and remember? By the late 1960s, for one example, even before we get to the culture war of the 1980s, FBI agents are not just infiltrating through COINTELPRO, the usual story you know about the Black Panther Party, about what they considered black or racial hate groups. But in fact, turns out that some of the organizations and activities that they were most keenly concerned with, and I quote here from one FBI memo, quote, a study group whose purpose is to promote an interest in black culture. In another organization in Pittsburgh, they identified, and I quote directly, a teenage group active in issuing public letters protesting solicitation of Negro girls in ghetto areas by white males. In other words, the intersection of youth activism around social issues in those communities and historical consciousness as a form of political agency was the ultimate threat. Was a threat we never realized. That means in our humanities there's tremendous power. No wonder there has been a divestment in these claims. New York, for example, identified fewer than 100 prospective targets and focused on groups whose sole mission was spreading African culture in Harlem. It's a wonder the Schomburg Center survived. And I'm actually looking for archival evidence for this time period to see if there is a story to be told about agents provocateurs involved in the Schomburg and whether or not it was a focus of FBI surveillance. What a powerful cautionary tale about the incredible relationship between history, the humanities, and the world that we live in. So if the digital humanities has the potential to have this incredible reach, to tell new stories, to access people from all over the globe, we have to be vigilant and guardians of whether we actually can penetrate, rather than just simply having the tools to do so. Let me close then by way of illustrating that what happened in the late 60s and 70s is happening right before our very eyes. Some of you know these stories, so I'm not meant to tell you something you don't know, but I do want you to appreciate them in the larger context of this. You, of course, know that, and my dear friend Tiffany was there in 2010 when the state regents of Texas decided that the history books were a little bit too pro-brown, too much black, too secular. In other words, the very history that represents what you produce, the stories that you tell from the archives, that your scholars are able to inform and to educate, was exactly the kind of history that the Texas Board of Regents, not all of them, but a Republican majority decided Texas children should not learn. Therefore, setting in motion the possibility that textbooks across the nation be revised to represent less of this version of America's historical past. You know that, for example, right now in the state of Arizona, ethnic studies is illegal. That to teach, inspired by the effort to teach Mexican descendant children the history of their people in Arizona when it was once Mexico, is anti-American, according to the state legislature that decided that it was divisive. This sounds so familiar to the debates in the late 1980s about the balkanization of America, the disuniting of America that Arthur Schlesinger wrote about. We're in this loop, in this cycle, precisely because the stakes are exceedingly high for what we do. I don't want you to turn to the digital space as a kind of metaphor for putting on your Beats headphones and your white earphone buds and not actually be plugged in to what is happening out in the real world. The Southern Poverty Law Center looked at a sample of all 50 state curriculums on what of the civil rights movement is being taught in our nation's school systems. Now think about this, so I want to be clear. State level curriculum, exactly what Texas was working on, doesn't exactly mean that enterprising teachers or schools don't do more than what the states say is required. But as a way of studying what is required is a way of saying what is important, what matters, what is valuable. And let me remind you that in a moment where we pat ourselves on the back and celebrate the fact that we can elect a member of our minority population, that we can put a black man in the White House, is evidence of America's exceptionalism. Its ability to do things that no other Western democracy has been capable of. And that story is the success story of the civil rights movement. To hell with all the backsliding that's happened over that past 50 years, where poverty is greater now than it was in the 1960s, where inequality across all sectors of society is the worst that it's been since the Great Depression, or that we have a prison system that is unrivaled in the world. None of that really matters with the symbolic representation of a black man. But even if we took that at face value, what should we say of the civil rights movement that everyone agrees made that possible? That the rhetoric of a post-racial America is the rhetoric of America where we are judged by the content of our color and not the content of our character and not the color of our skin. So wouldn't you think that this civil rights history would be a history worth telling, a history worth celebrating, a history worth knowing for all of its complexity? Wouldn't it be the entry point for our visitors from Mars to learn something about not only where we came from, but the hard work it took to get there so that we might be vigilant about protecting those gains? Makes sense to me, or am I just too close to this? Well, exactly the opposite is happening. So in that scan of those 50 states, the Southern Poverty Law Center found that by their standards, first of all, the results were so bad that to get an A, for example, to excel in civil rights history teaching in K through 12 across the states, all you had to do was get 65%. And the way they did this, in case you're wondering, is, and I'm going to make this very quick, if you said something about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, she sat down on the bus and he gave a famous speech, then, okay, maybe you passed. You got at least a D. But if you talked about Ella Baker as the godmother of the civil rights movement, if you talked about Fannie Lou Hamer as a rural sharecropper who became the face and the voice and the authentic communicator and translator of the experience of Mississippi in the 1960s and a call for America to live up to the promises of democracy. If you talked about Bob Moses, if you told the difference between SCLC and CORE, NAACP and SNCC, if you talked about that complexity, then you moved closer to an A. Okay, you get it. So 3 states got an A. 3 states. And since I'm here in Delaware, I'm going to look you up real quick to see what you all came up with. So bear with me. Oh, I see. Woo! So those three states, were Alabama, Florida, and New York. At the low end of the scale, 35 states flat out failed. Failed. And of those 35 states that failed, so that meant they didn't even say talk about King or Rosa Parks. That's what we mean by fail. Of those 35 states that failed, 16 of them required nothing. Right? Nothing. It's not in the curriculum. It's not required. And unfortunately, Delaware received a 0% score. F. What does that tell us about what we do? What is the digital humanities if it's not a story about who we are, about our past, about our messiness, about our complexity, about what is possible, what we once did and stopped doing? History is not linear. The amazing thing about literature is precisely because it uses the imagination to tell stories about human beings that oftentimes capture our complexity in ways that the actual archival record cannot reveal. That's a shout out to my English professors. Finally, if that's not scary enough, in a recent book where the best and brightest of Black America were asked to leave some advice for the future, to tell young people how to be successful today. And I'm wearing my American Studies hat, as you can tell. I'm drawing from many different kinds of texts to talk about where we are right now on these subjects. So Ellis Coase, a journalist and writer, has written extensively on race, spent many years at Newsweek, wrote a book about the glass ceiling for Black professionals in corporate America called Rage of a Privileged Class back in the mid-90s. Had a kind of sequel published in 2010 called The End of Anger. He polled the perspectives of Harvard MBAs and graduates of a program called A Better Chance, which sends underprivileged kids to elite boarding schools. Asked them, hey, what do you think about the future of race in America? Are you less angry today now that a Black man is in the White House? And the general answer was, yes, we are less angry. But if you happen to be older, as Chris Rock said, the only real racists are old Black men. So they tended to be a little bit less or more angry than young folk. But the signposts of this moment, the zeitgeist of this time, is evidenced in what the Harvard MBA said at the end of the book in an addendum called 10 Rules of Success. And I'm just going to quote a few. Number 1, you can only go so far as your networks will take you. Number 4, embrace self-discipline and perseverance as virtues. Number 7, cultivate people who are more powerful and important than yourself. Rule number 10, never talk about race or gender if you can avoid it, other than to declare that race or gender does not matter. I mean, so why even bother with all this, right? I mean, after all, right? Why bother? If race or gender does not matter, right? If that's the recipe for success, if that's where we're heading, why spend $2.4 million dedicated to a project to talk about people of African descent, to define race, both in terms of subjectivity and in terms of a counter-narrative to a Eurocentrism that is embedded everywhere in our culture, one to which Schomburg dedicated himself to challenging and to upending? Why do it? That's what we're up against. Are we going to be on the sidelines? In other words, can the digital humanities save us is only a question that we ourselves can answer if we're willing to save ourselves. If we don't fight for the humanities, if we don't fight for the history of this nation and indeed the world in all of its beauty and ugliness, we'll just keep blowing the bubbles on Wall Street. Thank you. I can hear you and I'll repeat it back.
Okay. So you're going to tell them I said it was fabulous, right? Okay.
She said it was fabulous.
My question is, so how do we engage these conversations? How do we, as a research institution, start to build bridges with K through 12 centers using these spaces? Because there seems to be a disconnect between what we do in the academy at this level and how we impact back. I shouldn't say back, connect to K through 12,
Yeah.
which is what I think you were trying to.
Yeah.
And when you have roadblocks, I'm thinking of Arizona, where the governor said, we're not going to teach ethnics. You can't teach ethnic studies.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question, and the truth is all of us need to help figure it out. So I'm not offering here the magic bullet or the panacea, but what I can say is this. You know, I spent almost all my professional life in an academic setting. 8 years of graduate school, 6 years at Indiana University, and a couple of years on a postdoc. So I'm only new to this space. This is only the last 3 years of my life. But what I can tell you is making the switch from an academic setting where all the incentives run towards specialization, all the incentives run towards not being off campus. It's even hard in some academic settings to move outside of your department and not be penalized for it. I can't quite put my finger on who's responsible for that, right? In some ways, it's less relevant than that it is a problem, which is to say that the way the incentives run this day, the smartest people in the world are increasingly talking to smaller and smaller audiences. And I know that's inside the bubble, an easy thing to get away with saying as opposed to out there. But the attacks on intellectualism are real, are absolutely real. And they are a reactionary politic in response to what us academics have done to the impressionable minds of Americans, to make them think that America is not the greatest country on earth. And if we as academics stay in our silos, if we only speak to our students, though their numbers shrink, and to the choirs of our colleagues, then those folks occupying the K through 12 educational speech, which is big business growing bigger by the day. Charter schools are about privatization. No matter what you think about what one charter school may be doing that is fabulous for a marginalized, impoverished black or brown or even white community where the public school is terrible, it is fundamentally about outsourcing the responsibility of the public to educate. Therefore, those folks are not interested in what we have to say other than what they need to extract from us for the purposes of winning their bids. So privatization is itself in education part of a larger piece. You all know this, where, you know, smart people in the room, you get that. But what I heard someone once say, representing a small business owner in a conversation about the Affordable Care Act and whether or not people would have to fire people, he said, listen, you know, we have to remember that a small business owner's first priority is to make money. Therefore, hiring a new person is counter to what we are trying to do. In other words, you maximize profits right up to the point where you have to hire a new person or in order to make more money. But you wait until the last possible moment. So although growth within a small business context is predicated on increasing your employees, you're not increasing your employees because you're trying to grow the economy. You're trying to make money, and by dint of that, you increase the number of employees. It's an important thing to remind her, and in the metaphor of where we sit in relationship to the privatization of public education in this country is they will only come to us at the last possible moment to extract from us what they need in order to make money. It will come in the spirit of education, of civic engagement, of pride, but it is about making money. And whether or not, again, this is not a cast a blanket aspersion on every educator who is in the field of charter schools. But as we move greater and greater along, history suggests to us that it will invite other players to the field who are less altruistic, less inclined to maintain a mission-based focus, and will hustle their way into the field. So we have to be involved in conversations about education. If we think we have something to say about what is actually taught in the nation's classrooms, we have to break down the walls of schools of education. We have to say, hey, I thought it was shameful. I paid no attention to it at IU until I was asked to teach a class that was primarily for future teachers. Right? This happens. I'm sure it happens here. Do you have a school of education? Yeah. So first of all, I didn't even realize, because I'm in my own silo, that teachers who are in schools of, so future teachers in the School of Education track may only take 1 or 2 history classes. Like, how absurd. How absurd that history or English are cornerstones of liberal arts education. Like, just having a facility to understand not just the past, but how to create new knowledge by having basic critical skills. I mean, what are they going to teach in the classroom? I didn't even understand it until I was teaching an African American history course within the School of Education, and I realized that none of my students had ever taken a history class. No history class, let alone African American history. So that's not acceptable. And we need deans and provosts. We need faculty to say this is not the way to protect our democracy. That there are some core values here, and then we get back into the space. So that's why those culture wars are so critical, because when we have that conversation about what is fundamental to protecting our democracy, then it's a conversation about whose history counts, whose history matters. It's dirty, it's messy, you lose friends, people stop talking to you, but that's the work. Yes?
I'm actually a certified social studies teacher in the state of Delaware. I came through the UD social studies education program, and now I'm pursuing my master's degree in history here because I'm all about precisely what you're talking about. I feel so energized that what I'm doing matters, that I'm so anyway, could you kind of speak to, piggybacking off that, what I guess, A, an ideal social studies education program would look like in the future, and B, what current social studies education students, undergraduates, graduates, what have you, can do with the limited resources they have right now. I actually think UD's program is a lot better than others, and that it's very content heavy, but that's really not the norm. What they can do with the limited resources they have to be competent enough to, do what you're talking about.
Well, okay, so there are limits to what I can speak to with experience or expertise, so let's just say that from the start. But I can tell you that right now, so there are a couple things that the Schomburg is doing that I'm involved with that get closer to what you're asking. One of which is that currently, as you know, if you try to do social studies in a content-driven way that falls outside the boundaries of state-approved curriculum, it's dead in the water. Unless, of course, you have a renegade teacher who goes above and beyond. And you can teach that in a school of education by making the stakes clear. Of course, people might lose their jobs, but that's what social movements look like. It's the price you pay. That's one example. But the other example is that Schomberg right now is actively engaged in developing curriculum that will be taught out of school. Because for us, we can make an immediate impact by transforming the conversation about enrichment programs that are incredibly light on the humanities. They're about mentoring, they're about financial literacy, they're about STEM, homework help. I mean, you will be hard-pressed to find, if you survey the landscape, locally, nationally, of out-of-school time activities for young people. And you've heard of the Harlem Children's Zone. Jeff Canada's mug was on television for a couple of years few years ago in an American Express commercial, essentially the biggest social experiment in out-of-school time in the history of out-of-school time. 11,000 kids in that program, all getting corporate-backed money to basically take them from 3:30 to 5:30 with professionals, although very questionable since I now have worked with them, in providing a kind of constructive space for enrichment and life skills coaching. You think they're teaching any history? You think they're giving these kids critical text to read? You pick it. I don't care. It could be Charles Dickens or Malcolm X, both of which lend themselves to important and relevant questions about the experiences of those young people. They don't do it because no one told them it was valuable. And no one told them it was valuable because for any number of reasons we've been working against the power of historical narratives, as I've described in the FBI counterattacks. That's just one example. So in other words, Schomburg is right now building curriculum and capacity to put in the hands of those professionals and out of school a roadmap to do, historical work. Historical literacy is what we call it. We're working with the National Urban League and the Children's Defense Fund. We are also right now at the table with the history, it's called the History Education Center at Teachers College. Betty Weinecke, I think is her name. She works with my director of education. So again, I'm not in the room all the time. And what are we doing? We're talking with Teachers College, a leading school of education in this country, with its history educators about how can they take a leadership position in transforming the conversation about the quality of historical teaching in this country, how we train teachers to teach history. And they are in conversation with Schomberg and leading historians to do that work, meaning that there are opportunities for this not just to happen between Columbia University and the Schomburg Center. This should be happening everywhere because we all have a stake in this conversation. And I can tell you, my mom was an educator for many years. I mean, the educational field about what actually goes into the content of our classroom, it has nothing to do with what we teach as historians. It just says there's no relationship. So God help us if some of these kids get to college and we get a chance. I mean, how many of you who teach in the humanities have looked out in a room full of students, start teaching a lesson and literally watch the light bulbs go off? I mean, just watch the light. People are transformed. No wonder then that presidential candidates on the Republican Party are calling college a snob, that it's anti-American to insist that people have to go to college. I mean, these are real debates happening about the threat that college poses to hardworking real Americans. I hate to make this sound so partisan, but it is what it is. So you can help to craft partnerships here from the University of Delaware between history and the School of Education, between the history of the School of Education and what's happening in out-of-school time. And if you want to take on a political fight, which is a state-level fight, get involved in lobbying. I mean, that's where the fight is. That's where it counts. That's where the work remains for us at this point. Yes?
I like the fact that you showed, you all created lesson plans, that you had a team that did that. And I think I've seen other models. I think digital humanities have come along so that that's often included now.
Talking about lesson plans in the digital Schomburg.
And Massachusetts Historical Society is another nice model where when they digitized John Adams' papers, they funded school teachers to come in the summer to build lesson plans with the digital content. So, it makes the digital content more accessible to people of all ages, but it helps come up with a way to teach with this digital content.
Right. No, it's powerful. There is nothing stands in the way of a teacher standing in the classroom and pulling up this website and doing something with it, period. Nothing. Not even the Texas Board of Regents. because they're not going to be in the classroom, right? Nothing stands in the way of that. But if the teachers don't know, and if the teachers aren't inspired to do it, and if the teachers, some of them aren't willing to take those risks and say, you know, if the assistant principal shows up today and we're doing in motion, because I've got some kids in here who want to learn a little bit of something about being of Caribbean ancestry, for crying out loud, that this is a good thing, that they're going to read an essay that hasn't been approved or didn't show up in my packet that I've been handed, then those are chances worth taking. I'll mention just briefly, we do run a summer Teachers Education Institute. It runs the second week in July. It is tuition-based. We're working to make it continuing education and get accreditation, which is one of the reasons why we're working with Columbia. But we bring leading scholars of Africana history to the Schomburg all day to engage teachers and educators. And not only do they learn new things, but they're in conversation about how to use that material, and they work with the archivists to explore primary research. You'd be amazed at how many new, green, energetic, excited teachers themselves don't even know what to make of a primary document. Just, you know, if they're not taking history classes, God knows they're not focused on how to make use of archival material. That's one thing. The other thing is we do run a youth program. We have about 125 young people who come to the Schomburg in a Saturday program from October to May called Junior Scholars. They work with primary material, they work with the archivists, they work with teaching instructors, they do common readings. Last year they read Autobiography of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, The Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl. They then break up in the second half of the year, it runs October to May, into small groups where they learn certain kinds of artistic and cultural skills that we see as critical to not just learning something, but learning how to express it. So there's spoken word, poetry, there's visual arts, there's digital photography, there's a dance class, there's theater production, there's hip hop history. I think that's it. So the notion here, oh, there's scholarship in journalism. So one team works on producing an annual magazine called the Schomberg Review, which is a representation of the year's activity. So these are different kind of life skills, right? These are the kinds of life skills that take an understanding of the past, remix it and repackage it through a young person's voice and experience, which is exactly what happens when you give them research assignments in college. Which is exactly what happens when they read a book and then you ask them to write a paper, whether it's a creative writing assignment or it's a boring research paper. That process of engaging it and communicating it back through your own voice is transformative. And so our kids are middle school all the way to high school, as young as 10 and as old as 18 or 19. And there are very few places, in fact, we can't find any that do what we do on the scale that we do with as much time as we do it. Children's Defense Fund under Marion Wright Edelman does freedom schools for 6 weeks in the summertime, where young people read from a common reading list of significant works in African American history led by college-age students who are their instructors. And so they're being transformed by engaging this literature, but it's 6 weeks in the summer. Everybody should be doing junior scholars if we care about the relationship of humanities to our democracy, which is the fight that we have to make. I think we're out of time.
He's been talking for 90 minutes.
Thank you all.